The world is losing its trees. That's despite a decades-long effort to stop deforestation. A report says last year's goal of ending the practice by 2030 is now out of reach. So what's behind this destruction? And can it be stopped? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. A report by Global Forest Watch says the Earth lost a staggering 11.1 million hectares of forest last year. Wildfires fanned by global warming and human activity, such as logging and farming, are causing our forests to shrink ever further. The losses include nearly 4 million hectares of tropical rainforest, which are critical to capturing carbon dioxide. The rate of tropical deforestation last year was equivalent to 10 football pitches every single minute. All that despite a pledge by more than 140 countries to end and reverse deforestation by the year 2030. And while some have made progress, that deadline won't be met without a sharp decline in forest losses worldwide. Well, let's take a look at some of the other findings of this report. Tropical rainforest losses last year resulted in 2.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. That's equivalent to India's annual fossil fuels emissions, and that's the world's third largest polluter. 40% of all tropical rainforest loss was in Brazil. Wildfires there were responsible for under a quarter of that. Most of it came from agriculture expansion and logging. And whilst global tropical forest loss slightly decreased in 2021, boreal forests in cold climates saw unprecedented losses. 6.5 million hectares were lost to wildfires in Russia alone. Let's bring in our guests now. And in the US state of North Carolina, we have Frances Seymour. She's Distinguished Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, which released this report. In Amsterdam, Wessel Van Eeden, a Global Communications Director at justdiggit. That's an organisation working to regreen Africa. And in Oxford, UK, Michael Jacobs, an environmental economist at the University of Sheffield. A very warm welcome to all of you. Frances, you were involved in producing this report. It makes for pretty shocking reading. Are you surprised that we're still seeing this much deforestation across the world, some 2 decades after your organisation, the Global Forest Watch, started monitoring these forests?
You know, disappointed but not surprised. As you suggest, we do now have 20 full years of data from satellite imagery monitoring and have seen just a steady, persistent, stubborn loss of forests at this level. You mentioned last year in 2021, more than 11 million hectares just in the tropics, and of that, 3.75 million hectares of the primary tropical forests, which are the most valuable from the point of view of carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, indigenous peoples. So it's really a catastrophe. But really, for the last 20 years, that loss of humid tropical forest, primary forest, has hovered between 3 and 4 million hectares for 20 years now. So it's another step. I would also say that, in fact, the pledge to end forest loss by 2030 was made in November. So most of this loss had already occurred by the time of the pledge. So maybe we can see this as a baseline against which to judge performance against those pledges. OK, we'll certainly look more at those pledges a little later in this discussion.
Right now, I want to focus a little bit more on the impact of this deforestation. And Wessel, we've got 10 football pitches of virgin forest being lost every minute. Oh, my goodness, when I was a teenager, I'm going to age myself here, some sort of 20 to 30 years ago, these figures were being bandied around then. I remember football pitch size patches of rainforest being lost every single minute. It was shocking then, it's shocking now. What is the impact of this?
Yeah, the impact is devastating, as we all know. So I think, we're in the midst of a global climate crisis, as I think, especially the panelists, but I think the majority of people are now aware. However, what it sometimes lacks is all the doom and gloom that's being portrayed, which is scientifically very true. does not lead to a lot of hope and inspiration for people to actually be able to do something. So what we as Just Dig It try to do is to really focus on solutions, nature-based solutions. And even though the numbers are devastating, again, no denying that, we do believe that regreening is possible and that there are a lot of things that we can do as humanity if we only have the will to do it together. It's not rocket science, but we need to do it now because the time to talk about climate change and deforestation is really over.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you are here to provide some sort of beacon of hope. I know you're very active in East Africa, and we will get more onto that a little bit later. But first of all, just keeping with the report, Indonesia, for example, is a success story in this report. It has reversed some of its deforestation. Why is that happening, Wessel, and how?
Well, I think due to the government really opening up to the fact that they have some natural resources which are really valuable, and that the more and more, luckily, people are starting to recognize these as assets and not as natural resources alone, but really as economical assets to a country. So I think the example of Indonesia is a perfect example that, yes, we can turn the tide if there's only a will and also the legislation to back it up.
Michael, of course, this is a tenuous success in Indonesia. We've got to remember that there is always going to be pressure to reuse forested land. What sort of pressures does Indonesia face, and can it withstand it?
The pressures are huge and they've just grown larger. We are now experiencing a very sharp rise in food prices, which of course is causing great difficulties for many poorer people around the world, but it increases the incentive for clearing land for agriculture. And in Indonesia, there has been a moratorium on new palm oil forests, plantations. Palm oil is one of Indonesia's principal exports, and it's something consumed in huge numbers of products, not just foods actually, but other products as well that use vegetable oils. And that moratorium has definitely contributed to the reduction in the rate of loss of Indonesia's rainforest. Remember, this is not an absolute decline or an absolute increase in forestry. It's a rate of loss which is slowing. That's good news. But with the ending of that moratorium and with very high food prices, you will see huge pressures to plant more trees, to take more land from virgin forest, to turn it into plantation land. And in other parts of the world, for example, Brazil, to grow crops which are more profitable than they were even last year. So the land pressures, which arise not just within those countries, but of course from our consumption. We in the northern countries are the major consumers of many of the things which come from those places, are huge. And that is why we have so much deforestation. The economic pressures are leading to it.
I mean, there has been quite a campaign, hasn't there, Michael, against palm oil, and I think most people are aware of it, if not aware of how widespread it is found in all our products. So why hasn't that caught on more?
Well, it's caught on a little bit, and one of the major successes of the last few years has been the number of multinational corporations, particularly northern ones, where there is some consumer pressure from consumers in northern countries, global north countries. So that has been a relative success story, but it isn't every company, and there are many companies that are not taking part in that attempt to reduce palm oil from deforested areas. The problem is that the pressures are huge, and when a product is very profitable, it becomes much harder to prevent farmers and landowners planting crops, cutting down trees, because they make so much money from doing so relative to the alternatives. And unfortunately, although it is absolutely true that forests are in themselves resources, in a global market, you're competing against the other things you could do with that land. And that's where high food prices will make things more difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, Francis, if we look at Brazil, for example, one of the main pressures there is agriculture, putting cattle onto the land, clearing it for beef, which is a huge commodity on the global market. The pressures that Jair Bolsonaro is under to create more money for his country are huge. And we see that reflected, don't we, in the amount of deforestation. So what can be done to stop that domestic pressure?
So I think comparing the Indonesia and Brazil cases over the last 20 years is quite illuminating in that their deforestation trajectories have diverged not once, but twice, even though they face a common international environment. So you may recall that, in Brazil, in the early years of this century, the Amazon was up in flames and had, historically high, unprecedented deforestation rates. And yet when the Lula administration came in and really mounted a whole of government approach to enforcing the law and providing incentives and disincentives to municipalities, to perform, and the Soy Traders Association imposed a voluntary moratorium on sourcing soy from recently deforested land. And the combination of all these things, including recognizing indigenous territories, establishing new protected areas, brought the rate of deforestation down by something like 80%, even while continuing an increase in the production of the main commodity drivers of deforestation, which then as now were beef and soy. And that success was maintained for about a decade of dramatic reduction in deforestation rates. But then the political economy domestically changed. And since then, a lot of that success story has been unraveled in the last few years. And we've seen, I think just in the last year, an uptick of 9% in the part of the Brazilian Amazon that's being cleared for this commodity agriculture. But by contrast, in Indonesia, for the first 15 years of this century, we had a steady upward march of deforestation. And as has been suggested, that was due mostly to palm oil, but also clearing for fast-growing timber for the pulp and paper industry. But for me, the key factor in Indonesia was the catastrophic forest fires in 2015, which all Indonesians suddenly realized the cost of not protecting forests. Hundreds of thousands of people with respiratory disease, cost to the economy. And that's when the law enforcement, the moratorium enforcement, as well as these private sector commitments really kicked in.
But if you can't rely on the national leadership to take leadership in deforestation, where does the role of the international community come in, Francis? I mean, should we be using more of an incentives approach or even a punitive approach, such as sanctions?
I think it needs to be a mixture of carrots and sticks. And the question you've asked is right to the point in terms of how international cooperation is approached. I think at the outset, we need to recognize that a heavy-handed approach or an approach that could be interpreted correctly or incorrectly as protectionist in nature will have exactly the opposite effect that we might want. And we've seen again and again, a sort of national sovereignty protection response to heavy-handed impositions of restrictions, or worse, a reaction to, for example, putting into place domestic biofuel mandates as an alternative market for, in this case, palm oil, in case the European or other markets are closed. And so what we don't want to do is have the perverse effect. So in my view, a mix of carrots and sticks, for example, I think it's perfectly reasonable to work with the producer countries to close markets to illegally produced commodities. That's already been done for illegal timber. And now we're in the process of discussing how it can be done for commodities produced on illegally cleared land. But in addition, we need to provide carrots. And the one that we have an international framework for is performance-based finance for success in reducing emissions from deforestation. It's called REDD+. It's been agreed to under the Paris Agreement by up to 200 countries. And we really need to really up the finance, the positive reward for doing what countries can do, but need the incentive to do so.
Wessel, are you seeing any positive rewards in the areas where you're working? I mean, you're in East Africa, you're doing a lot to re-green those countries there, but also Gabon in this report was found to decrease its deforestation rates. It's been a success story. Are these countries being rewarded for their efforts?
Well, I think the countries, maybe not per se, but I think the communities, which in the end is where we believe the change really starts, is in the local communities, they're being rewarded. And to give you one example, we work a lot with agroforestry, which is basically focusing on smallhold farmers in Eastern, but now also expanding throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, combining trees with crops. is not only providing them with more healthier soils, etc., but really providing with more crop yield. So by inspiring communities and helping them to realize sustainable agroforestry practices on their land, you will see that they're economically incentivized. And again, keep in mind there are over 350 million smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. So can you imagine the potential impact if we are able to inspire and educate those communities to take better care of their lands in a more sustainable way, which does not only economically benefit them, but in the end will benefit all of us through carbon sequestration by combining trees with crops. So there are beautiful examples. And I think the communities benefiting in the end will make sure that the countries benefit as well.
Okay. Well, as we mentioned just a little earlier, 141 countries signed a declaration at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow last year to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. Now, signatories agreed to promote sustainable trade and development that doesn't worsen deforestation and to increase investments in rural and indigenous communities to develop sustainable agriculture and forest management. But critics like Greenpeace say the pledge's 2030 goal effectively allows another decade of forest exploitation and is non-binding. Michael, Brazil was one of those 141 countries to sign this pledge, and yet we are seeing no sign of it halting deforestation. It's literally chopping down trees as it's signing away its promise not to do so. How much store do you lay in such pledges? How much optimism do you attach to them?
Well, it must be better to have the pledges than not to have them. There is no question that when countries sign declarations like this in public, and it was also companies and financiers who signed that declaration, they do come under some pressure, usually domestic pressure, but also international pressure, to abide by those pledges. But of course, that pressure may be much less than the pressures that they have internally, domestically. And in the case of Brazil and Bolsonaro, you get the feeling that, frankly, he signed that in order to make Brazil look good on the international stage, but had absolutely no intention of enacting it at home. But in other countries, those pledges do mean something. So it must be better to have them than not. But Greenpeace is right that in themselves, the pledges are not really enough. And we're seeing this, of course, in climate change action in every field. This is true in the general targets that countries and companies have got, and in specific energy targets and so on, which is that targets are the easy part. To say we will achieve something by 2030, or in many other areas 2050, is an easy thing for a politician or indeed a company to do. The hard thing is to enact the policies or the behavioral changes which make those targets realizable. And that's where we need to see much more action. So I'm happy that there are targets, but what you need to see are on the ground policies to make the targets achieved. And in particular, in the forestry field, it isn't just about the land use policies, it's about the enforcement of them. The difference between energy and forestry is that there are a rather small number of energy users, the big companies that produce most of the energy in the world, and you can regulate them and tax them and give them incentives, and they are part of an organized system of policy in most countries. Deforestation occurs through thousands and thousands of landowners and people who use other people's land, and it occurs over massive areas. The very size of the areas that we're talking about, the size of the UK every year deforested, just gives you an idea of how difficult it is to enforce the law, let alone where there has been no law. This is also about enforcement, and that's where much more money and effort needs to go.
And also, I suppose, where organisations like Wessel's justdiggit come in, because they are on the ground working with those local communities at the very grassroots level. Wessel, do you think that there is enough organisations like yours working throughout the world?
Well, there's never enough to begin with. No, I think there can be more. And I think one important thing to add is here, because we're talking about legislation and government pressure and regulations, and I completely agree that, it's very difficult. It's easier when it comes to the energy sector because there's a limited amount of players and you can put, laws on them and make them behave accordingly. But I think when it comes to restoration, because it's not only about conservation, but really restoration is what justdiggit is all about. communication is so important. And again, like I said previously, not only the doom and gloom part where we state the facts, like, you know, the amount of deforestation that's going on. We need to keep doing that. It's very important. But also people tend to react better to hope and inspirational stories. So what justdiggit is trying to do, not only in Africa, but especially focus on Europe and Africa, is just to tell the stories of how relatively simple, and again, relatively it is, to regreen enormous plots of land. Low cost, low tech, you know, going back to the roots of farming where we used to come from, and not this intense meat producing farming, but really looking at, you know, agroforestry and the potential of the smallhold farmers. And we really believe positive storytelling goes a long way. So we work with a lot of partners who help us in kind to tell that story. And what we see is there's so much young people, especially, reacting to that, getting a lot of positive energy from, you know, at least there is a part of a solution. And we're not here to say, you know, this is the solution already behind what justdiggit is doing. But what we do see is that people are in dire need of positive stories when it comes to climate change. And yes, we should keep legislating the big polluters, but positive storytelling is really something that goes a long way.
Wessel, I completely take your point and agree with you, but unfortunately I am going to have to go back to the biggest doom and gloom aspect of this report at the moment, because it's a crucial bit that we haven't touched on yet. And Francis, is that the Amazon rainforest is almost at tipping point. Now, this I found incredibly scary. What does it mean to be at tipping point? Because it also says that if this happens, it blows out of the water all efforts to contain global warming. Can you expand a little bit more on that for us?
Certainly. So the idea of a tipping point is that at a certain degree of tree cover loss in a forest ecosystem like the Amazon, that one can get into a positive feedback loop in which continuing deforestation leads to warmer and drier conditions, which makes the forest more vulnerable to fire, which in turn releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, leading to warmer and drier conditions and more vulnerability to fire, and so on. And scientists have been warning about the possibility of a tipping point in the Amazon rainforest for quite a number of years now, in which if we pass that point, the entire rainforest ecosystem would be converted into a grassland savanna. And if that happened, all of the carbon that's currently contained in the vegetation, which some of the most carbon dense as well as biodiverse places on the planet, would be released up into the atmosphere. And that's what would blow the Paris Agreement targets out of the water. And unfortunately, the latest science is showing that that tipping point may be closer than we had originally understood, and that it's being driven, not only by the global warming and climate change to which all emissions contribute, but also the local deforestation causes warmer conditions. It dries up the rainfall such that the whole thing could tip more quickly than we thought.
Michael, what's your thought on this, just briefly in the last minute that we have left? Are we going to reach that tipping point?
I defer to the scientists on this, but as Francis says, they are warning that these points are much closer than they used to be, and that is unsurprising because of the trends in deforestation. And it teaches us a really important lesson, which is that the earth is not something that you can simply plunder on a linear scale and say, well, in the end, if we lose all the trees, we lose the trees, because what you lose are whole ecosystems and the climatic balance that those ecosystems have created. We live in a world that we did not create, and we are totally dependent on that world, the natural world, for regulating the life conditions in which human societies live. And that's a really profound lesson, which human societies used to understand. And actually the people who live in the rainforests tend to understand that. They have lived in harmony with their natural environments for a very long time. And it's, of course, industrial societies, starting in the north of the world, which have tended to regard the natural environment as something to be exploited rather than to be lived within and as part of. And that is a very profound economic lesson that we all need to learn, and we need to learn it very rapidly, or else, as Francis says, we may hit those tipping points, and then we really do not know how catastrophic that could be.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope that this programme helps people take that on board, and that we do learn it and we don't reach that tipping point. Thank you very much to all of you for joining our discussion today. Francis Seymour, Wessel Van Eeden and Michael Jacobs. And thank you too for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.